with the latest release of Donkey Kong Country Returns HD. I figured now would be a good time to take a moment and revisit every Donkey Kong game on the Nintendo Switch. As I assembled this list, I was actually surprised by the number of games that feature Donkey Kong on the platform, even though, yeah, a lot of them are older games. Still though, there's some great stuff here, stuff that you shouldn't sleep on. But anyway, enough talking, let's just dive right into the list. Let's kick things off with the first Donkey Kong game to arrive on the Nintendo Switch, that being Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze. Now the Switch version is an enhanced port of the Wii U version, and it does feature a number of changes. A major one is that the game runs at a higher resolution now. The game runs at 1080p on Switch when it's in dock mode, while the resolution was just 720p on the Wii U. Another major change is the inclusion of a brand new mode called Funky Mode. This is a casual mode that allows you to play as Funky Kong. Funky Kong has 5 hearts now, basically 5 hit points, and he can perform continuous roll attacks, as well as continuous underwater corkscrew attacks. His surfboard that he has with him allows him to do a double jump, as well as allows him to slow a descent when falling, and it also grants him immunity to spike traps, as well as the ability to jump on most enemies that the other Kongs cannot jump on. He can also breathe indefinitely underwater, and he doesn't need to worry about air. As easy as Funky Mode might be, I still really like this. It's a neat take on an easy mode concept, and he's fun to fool around with, even if you're more of an original mode purist, as I am. That all aside, Tropical Freeze is a treat. It's a fantastic platformer, and it's one of the very best games in the Donkey Kong Country series. The gameplay and the controls in this one are spot on, and the levels themselves are just fantastic. The levels are just so well crafted, and they're chock full of secrets, so much so that you most likely will have to check out and explore each level multiple times in order to find everything. That's not a bad thing though with this game. It never feels like a chore. You'll want to keep playing. But yeah, seriously, this is a top quality 2D platformer, and if you like those types of games, then you absolutely need to check this one out. It's not just one of the best 2D platformers on the Switch, it's just one of the best 2D platformers period. After the re-release of Tropical Freeze, we began to see a ton of re-releases of classic games from DK's past for the Switch. Which yeah, it definitely includes the Nintendo Switch Online service stuff, and we'll get to that. But first, let's talk arcade stuff. Nintendo and Hamster, a company famous for arcade re-releases, decided to team up to release a bunch of Nintendo arcade games through their Arcade Archive service on the Switch. Of course that means all 3 Donkey Kong arcade games saw a release on Switch through this endeavor. Donkey Kong Jr., and Donkey Kong 3 arcade versions are all playable on Switch. Just like most Arcade Archives releases, these include multiple versions of the games in the release. Typically includes the international and Japanese versions, with online high score leaderboard support for it all. The Donkey Kong arcade game is one of the most important games in video game history, and it's one that is still a lot of fun to play. You're tasked with trying to save Pauline from Donkey Kong, who has kidnapped her. In all but one of the stages, you need to climb to the top as fast as you can in order to move on to the next stage. Being the original arcade game, this one includes all 4 stages: the construction site, the elevator stage, the cement stage, and the final stage, one where you need to remove the 8 Rabbids from the platforms so Donkey Kong can fall on his head. You'll need to master the mechanics of each stage, as well as the harder variants, in order to be able to reach some good high scores. And that's how the addiction starts, trying to learn the most effective strategies throughout all these stages, as well as the best ways to maximize your points too. This is one of the best games for those who are high score chasers. Donkey Kong Jr. changes things up a bit. Instead of playing as Jumpman, aka Mario, this time you're playing as Junior, DK's son, and he's trying to rescue his father Donkey Kong back from Mario. Yep, Mario's the bad guy this time around. While this is still a platformer, the gameplay is different this time around. Instead of jumping and climbing ladders and defeating enemies with hammers, this time the gameplay is centered around using Junior's climbing mechanics with vines. In each stage, he'll need to use the vines in order to reach the top, and in the key stage, he'll need to push the keys upward on the chains in order to unlock the locks and rescue Donkey Kong. That all said, I gotta admit, this game is hard. It's one game that you're going to need to put some serious work into in order to get somewhere. Difficulty aside though, a lot love this arcade version, and some even prefer it over the first Donkey Kong game. Donkey Kong 3 is a fairly divisive entry in the arcade trilogy. Instead of being a platformer, now the gameplay is more of a shooter with some light platforming mechanics. Instead of playing as Junior or Mario, this time around, you play as the exterminator named Stanley, who must shoot his bug spray at bugs as well as Donkey Kong in order to save the plants in the greenhouse. What does Donkey Kong want with the plants? Well, who knows? Honestly, none of this makes sense at all. Anyway though, in order to progress to the next stage, you'll need to do one of two things. Either push Donkey Kong all the way up to the top with your sprays, or defeat all the bugs in the stage. If Donkey Kong reaches the bottom of the vines, you'll lose a life, and of course, if you're hit by one of the bugs, you'll lose a life too. At the beginning of each life, you can knock down a super sprayer can, which will temporarily increase the power of your spray, allowing you to shoot faster and higher, as well as be able to push Donkey Kong higher up. Sadly though, the general movement of Stanley is pretty stiff, and in a game that requires speed, you will constantly feel like you're a step or two or three behind when moving him up the platforms and side to side. For those that attempt to play the arcade version, be prepared for some frustrating moments as you try to get a grip on Stanley's movements. The first 3 Donkey Kong games for the NES are ports of the arcade games made for the system. All 3 can be found on the NES app through the Nintendo Switch Online service. Some might view the NES versions as inferior, but if you're like me and grew up playing the NES ones, then you don't care if they're inferior or not. You probably got a soft spot for these. Donkey Kong for the NES, even though it is missing the cement level from the arcade game, is still quite good, and back then, it was considered one of the more playable home conversions of the game for a number of years. Donkey Kong Jr. retains all the levels from the arcade version, and in my view, is the best of the Donkey Kong NES home ports. Coming from the arcade version, the gameplay is generally pretty good. Actually, to be honest, this might be my favorite version of Donkey Kong Jr. I especially appreciate the easier starting difficulty compared to the arcade version. That's just my taste though. You might prefer the arcade version more. It's the same for me for Donkey Kong 3 for the NES. The arcade version gets ridiculous in its difficulty very quickly, but the easier difficulty for the NES version, at least when starting out, makes it a lot more enjoyable. Now the difficulty changes doesn't fix the game entirely, but at the very least, the NES version's changes from the arcade version will certainly help players to at least get a feel for the game before the butt-whooping begins. That said, this game's version has its own set of problems though. Because the game was made for a standard television, being on the NES and all, the game field is squished to a 4:3 aspect ratio. This makes the stages feel pretty claustrophobic compared to the arcade version. In the middle of 2024, we saw another Donkey Kong game get released for the NES NSO app. Yep, it's Donkey Kong Jr. Math. What the heck is this game, you ask? Well, it's a edutainment title. Yep, an educational video game. I can tell. You're pretty excited for this one. Anyway, this is one of the few educational games to come out for the NES. And in this one, players are tasked in calculate mode to reach a certain number held up by Donkey Kong by collecting numbers in one of the 4 basic arithmetic operation symbols. In exercise mode, players can solve fixed math puzzles by climbing chains to reach the correct numbers. Look, I'll get straight to the point. This is a pretty shallow game, even by late 80s edutainment game standards. And beyond being a curiosity, this stands as the worst game that Donkey Kong has ever been a part of. In 2020, the Super Nintendo app for Nintendo Switch Online got all 3 Donkey Kong Country games. These are fantastic 2D platformers, some of the very best for the Super Nintendo, and all these games are absolutely still worth playing. Donkey Kong Country was the first one that started it all. The 3D digitized sprites were certainly eye-catching to players at the time, but it's the gameplay that really was the true star of the show. In this one, players control either Donkey Kong or Diddy Kong, and with a push of a button, you can actually swap between them. While the controls are the same for both Kongs, each character has certain advantages over the other. Donkey Kong is stronger, and because of that, he's able to defeat certain enemies that Diddy Kong cannot, and can also slap the ground to reveal secrets. Diddy Kong, while he's not nearly as strong as Donkey Kong, he is a far more agile character. As you play, you can also find animal buddies to help you out in certain portions of the game, like Rambi, the rhino, who can charge through enemies, and Ungard, the swordfish, who can make the water levels much easier to navigate. The stages are fun to explore, there's lots of details and secrets and collectibles to find, and this really is some top-notch stuff from the SNES era. If you like platformers and have yet to play this one, then you gotta correct that. You are missing out. Donkey Kong Country 2 changes things up a bit by having players control Diddy and his girlfriend Dixie. That's right, no Donkey Kong this time. Instead, you're on a quest to save him. Seriously, what's up with Donkey Kong sequels that involve rescuing him? For a big strong creature, he sure likes to get captured a lot. Anyway, while Diddy pretty much controls the same as he was in the first game, Dixie has a pretty unique mechanic all her own. With her ponytail, she's able to hover in the air. This alone makes her a huge asset. You're able to recover from falls more easily, as well as slow down from falling, and you can move pretty far through the air. The levels take huge advantage of this mechanic too, with many secrets requiring her ability to even reach them at all. This also means that you'll want to protect her and make sure you have her at all times, because losing her to an enemy or so can really hurt and can limit your options as well as access to certain paths and areas. Beyond the new playable character, this game includes a new team-up mechanic, which allows you to throw one of the Kongs in various directions. This is great as it allows you to reach collectibles that can be out of reach, or even bonus stages that might be hiding off the screen. This game also features more animal buddies than the previous game, with their own unique powers, as well as you seem to be able to encounter them much more often than the previous game too. I really like this one. It's a blast to play, has some great levels, and some memorable music too. This might be my personal favorite of all the 3 DKC games for the Super Nintendo. Donkey Kong Country 3 is the last of the Super Nintendo games in the series, and this time, players control Dixie Kong and Kiddy Kong, who's also known as Dinky Kong in Japan. Like the prior game, you're on a quest to save Donkey Kong yet again, as well as Diddy Kong. Yep, he got himself captured too. Dixie Kong relatively controls the same as he was in the prior game, but Kiddy Kong kinda takes after Donkey Kong a little bit, and he has a new ability to be able to bounce across water. The Kongs can still team up, like in the prior game, which is especially useful since Kiddy Kong can be thrown to break open paths and obstacles that otherwise couldn't be broken. There's still animal friends to team up with along the way, as well as a few new ones, but largely this game just feels like more of the same. There's not a lot of new stuff here to separate itself from the previous 2 games. Also, the levels aren't nearly as memorable here, and ditto goes for the music. It's just not as good as the previous 2 games. Now don't get me wrong though, I still like the game. It's a good solid platformer. Still one of the Super Nintendo's very best. It just doesn't have the same impact as the previous 2 games do. Late last year, the Game Boy app, the Nintendo Switch Online service, received all 3 Donkey Kong Land games, all in the span of a couple of weeks. Donkey Kong Land largely takes its inspiration from the first Donkey Kong Country game, and at the time of its release, it was considered to be a pretty impressive game for the Game Boy, and a technical achievement. This is a fun platformer for the Game Boy. The mechanics from the Donkey Kong Country games translate well to the Game Boy system, and unlike the later DK Land games, this is more of a semi-sequel, with its own unique levels and such. So it's worth checking out if you're a fan of the DKC games. That said though, this is pretty challenging at times. Actually even more so than the Super Nintendo games. And that's partly because of the platform it's on, and due to a few of the design choices. Donkey Kong and Diddy Kong have some pretty big sprites here, and they take up a good size of the Game Boy screen, and the more zoomed in perspective will lead to a lot of unintended collisions with dangers as you play. Often players have to move more slowly in this one. You kinda have to peek forward in a level so you don't accidentally bump into something that you don't want to, or mistakenly fall down a pit. Also, if you have the green Game Boy palette in the settings enabled, or you're just playing on an original Game Boy screen itself, things can look very muddy, and it can be hard to distinguish things, like objects from the background. Luckily in the NSO app, you can select the Game Boy Color Screen option, and that just makes things a lot more clearer. Donkey Kong Land 2 is pretty much a condensed version or a modified take on Donkey Kong Country 2, with some changes to the levels, as well as some boss fight changes. Because of that, this one can feel more of a bit of a retread. That said, this one is still fun to play, and this game did attempt to address a bit of the difficulty issues that the first Donkey Kong Land game had, that I mentioned earlier. Still not a perfect experience though. Donkey Kong Land 3 is also, just like the former game, a condensed version or modified take of the Super Nintendo game, that being Donkey Kong Country 3. Again, same thing as with the second game, this one can feel like a bit of a retread after playing the Super Nintendo counterpart, maybe even more so with this one. That said though, out of the 3 Donkey Kong Land games, I actually prefer this one the most, mainly because I feel like they got it right in terms of addressing the issues that plagued the first 2 games, mainly with the enemy placement and the overall level design. It just feels like with their experience, they were much more aware of the Game Boy's smaller screen this time around. I feel like you get caught less with the "oh my god, here's the enemy out of the blue" like surprises with this one. It's got a less frustrating experience than the previous 2 games, though ultimately, it also leads to this game being much more of an easier game than the prior 2 entries. Though trust me, you won't find me complaining about that at all. Before I move on, I do want to bring some attention to a special version of Donkey Kong Land 3 that could be only found on the Japanese version of the Game Boy Nintendo Switch Online app. The version of Donkey Kong Land 3 that was released in Japan was made for the Game Boy Color only, and that's the version that can be found on the app there. Now this version does feature some changes from the version we got. Noticeably, this game has much less lag and slowdown instances compared to the Game Boy version, and it makes for an overall smoother gameplay experience. Additionally, because it's on the Game Boy Color, well, it's got a wider range of colors. The inclusion of more colors makes it a little bit more pleasing to the eye. The less slowdown and lag alone makes this version the one to seek out and play, even if all the text is in Japanese only. I mean, you can pretty much figure your way through it. I really like this one, and out of all the Donkey Kong Land games available for the Switch, this is the one I found myself playing the most. It's highly playable in my view. This is great. If you got a Nintendo Switch Online subscription in North America or elsewhere, then you can actually download the Japanese versions of the Nintendo Switch Online apps and get access to this game and other Japanese NSO games for no additional cost by following the guide I got linked down below and in the pop-up that you can see in the top right corner of this video. Now, it was an early video for the channel, so be mindful of my early mic setup. My apologies there, but if you check out that, it'll get you all hooked up on how to get everything rolling real quick. It's definitely worth a watch if you want a little bit more value out of your Nintendo Switch Online subscription. While we are talking about the Game Boy games on the NSO service, I do want to take a moment and mention that one of the included games in the Game & Watch Gallery 3 collection has a recreation of the Game & Watch version of Donkey Kong Jr. Actually, there's 2 versions of the game included here, a classic version and a modern version. The classic version aims to recreate the LCD electronic games experience for the most part, while the modern version is a remake essentially, featuring a few new levels to complete, as well as improved modern controls and movement. I'll be honest, I'm not a huge fan of the Game & Watch stuff. I never had any of them as a kid, so I wasn't exactly hooked on the classic version of this game, but I did find the modern version fun to play for at least a few minutes, as well as the other modern versions of the other Game & Watch games included in this collection. Mario vs. Donkey Kong for the Nintendo Switch is a remake of the Game Boy Advance game of the same name, which itself is a spiritual successor to Donkey Kong for the Game Boy, which itself is a spiritual successor to the original arcade Donkey Kong game. You got all that? Anyway, this is a puzzle platformer that sees Mario chasing after Donkey Kong while also trying to take back the mini Mario toys that DK has stolen. The levels within vary with different challenges and goals. Sometimes it consists of guiding Mario to find a key and then taking it to the exit, or finding a mini Mario toy within a level, and in some cases, guiding the mini Mario toys to the end of a level, kinda like a Lemmings type of gameplay. The Switch version includes a number of changes beyond the new 3D visuals and all. It has an option for local co-op multiplayer play, with Toad being the second character. Players can choose between two playstyles, casual and classic. Casual removes the time limit, adds checkpoints, and even allows Mario to take 5 hits before losing a life, while classic mode pretty much retains the classic experience and difficulty. It's safe to say, casual mode is pretty darn easy. My honest recommendation with it, while it's nice that they included it as an option, is just to stick to classic mode. In a lot of ways, casual mode completely ruins the challenge, and just makes it a complete cakewalk. Beyond that, 2 new worlds have been added for players to enjoy, with 30 new levels included across the 2. And finally, there's a new time attack mode option for those who want to race against the clock. Now I think the game is good itself, and the remake is good, and it's nice that they included new additions in the remake, but overall, it's a pretty short experience. 130 levels or so for the remake might seem like a lot, but you'll finish them pretty quickly, and it's easy to blow through this in just a few gaming sessions. Of course, there's some replayability to try to improve your times and getting all the collectibles in a level, but even that doesn't take too long to complete. Still though, if you haven't played the GBA original before, then this will be the one I recommend to check out, as it's the de facto best version of the 2 games, and it's a blast for the time you do get to play. For those who have played the original game, especially if you have done so recently, well then this can be a bit of a difficult game to recommend at its full MSRP price. I just don't think there's enough new stuff here to warrant a double dip. The latest Donkey Kong game to arrive for the Switch is, surprise surprise, another re-release. Donkey Kong Country Returns HD is an enhanced port of the 3DS version, which itself was a port of the original Wii version. This version features the inclusion of the new mode from the 3DS version, which is now called Modern Mode, that allows for extra hit points and new items for players to obtain. In addition to that, it includes new texture updates, small updates to the character models, and of course, it's now on HD and in a higher resolution, and the game is running again at 60 FPS versus 30 FPS that the 3DS version had. Beyond that, as a whole, this game is not that much different from prior releases. This is a pretty bare-bones update. That said, Donkey Kong Country Returns, as a whole, is a pretty fun game. The original version was developed by Retro Studios as a return, no pun intended there, to the classic DKC gameplay, which is why a lot of the gameplay is going to seem pretty familiar for those who played the prior games. The game, at the time, introduced new stuffs to the formula and some new mechanics, like DK and Diddy now sharing hearts to indicate their health status, so there's no more losing a Kong to a death anymore, as well as stuff like the ability to grab or cling onto grass patches, and Diddy having the ability to use a barrel jet to hover now. That's right, Dixie Kong, Diddy Kong don't need you anymore. The levels themselves are chock full of secrets and they're just fun to explore, and there's a good amount of challenge to them too. It's an awesome game, and it's worth checking out if you love platformers and have yet to play this game. This is just so hard to recommend to returning players because there's not a lot new here to differ itself from past releases. Heck, at least Tropical Freeze for the Switch got a brand new mode and a character to play as. The new mode included here was already done in the 3DS version. This release for the Switch just ends up being a missed opportunity. They should have done more with this release. I just felt like this video would be incomplete if I didn't at least talk about the Donkey Kong Adventure Expansion DLC for Mario plus Rabbids Kingdom Battle for the Switch. This beefy expansion for the game, set after the events of the main story, sees Rabbid Peach and Beepo teaming up with Donkey Kong and a Cranky Kong type Rabbid to take on the Rabbid Kong, a Donkey Kong-like Rabbid from the main game. The characters all complement each other very well and are useful with their different movesets. Donkey Kong is a powerhouse, Rabbid Peach is great for support, and Cranky Kong can attack multiple characters as well as attack via long range. The DLC also includes a new movement ability, the ability for characters to swing to certain areas and platforms. Between the new movement options and the synergy of the characters, those who love strategy games or like what they saw from the main game are really going to find a good time with the DLC expansion. If you own Mario plus Rabbids, Kingdom Battle, and liked what you saw in the main game, then you gotta pick up this DLC. You're gonna have a blast with it. Also to note, this expansion stands as the only real new experience for Donkey Kong on the Switch, beyond additions that were made to re-releases or remakes. And that's it for Donkey Kong games on the Nintendo Switch, at least for this moment. Even though there's been a lot of games released for the platform, there's still two glaring things about the whole list. The first being that every game has either been an enhanced port of some sort or a re-release of a classic game, barring the DLC expansion thing that was for Mario plus Rabbids Kingdom Battle. In short, there's been no new proper Donkey Kong game made for the Switch at all, and that fact just blows my mind. Maybe we'll see a new one come out for the Nintendo Switch 2 system, but as it stands, yeah, unless something crazy happens, this generation will be the first one without a really new Donkey Kong game in a long time. The second thing that stands out from the list is the fact that while a ton of DK's past games have been released for the Nintendo Switch, there's still a lot of past games out there featuring Donkey Kong that could arrive to the platform in the future, most likely through the Nintendo Switch Online service, which as we know now, will be shared with the Nintendo Switch 2. We could see games like Donkey Kong 94 for the Game Boy, or games like Donkey Kong 64 and Diddy Kong Racing for the N64 app. And let's not forget stuff like the GBA versions of the Donkey Kong Country games could arrive to the NSO service too. Yes, we already got the DKC games for the Super Nintendo app, but the GBA ones are special because they include a number of changes from those versions and brand new content. Oh yeah, and while we're at it, Nintendo might as well put out the Game Boy Color version of Donkey Kong Country on the Game Boy app too. Yep, that's a thing that exists. And hell, why not? Nintendo, bring back DK King of Swing for the GBA app if you're feeling truly crazy. But anyway, that's it for now. Let me know down below what your favorite Donkey Kong game is for the system, or what you'd like to see come out in the future for Nintendo's famous ape. Thank you so much for watching and subscribing. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you real soon on the next video.